Daniel Hayes, a billionaire with everything except the warmth of true love, never imagined that fate would lead him back to his first and only crush. When he finds Emily Carter, once the brightest girl in his life, now working as a janitor, old emotions resurface. But this time, he won't let her go. A lonely return, the private jet touched down smoothly on the runway of a small-town airport. Through the tinted glass, Daniel Hayes gazed at the town he once called home, a place filled with memories that had shaped him into the man he was today. A billionaire, a mogul, a man who had everything except the one thing his heart secretly longed for. The car ride through familiar streets sent a wave of nostalgia washing over him. The old diner on Main Street, where he had spent countless evenings with his childhood friends. The bookstore where he used to lose himself in novels, dreaming of a future beyond the small-town limits. And then, his high school. A ghost of a smile crossed his lips as the grand building came into view. This was where he had learned to fight for his dreams, where he had first felt the stirrings of love, and where he had last seen Emily Carter. Memories of a lost love, Emily. Just the thought of her name sent a dull ache through his chest. She had been his world once, his best friend, his first love, the girl he had been too afraid to confess to. She was the fire in his cold world, the melody in his silent moments. He still remembered the way she laughed, soft, musical, full of life. The way her honey-brown eyes sparkled whenever she talked about her dreams. She had wanted to become a writer, to create stories that touched hearts, and he had believed in her more than she believed in herself. "You're going to be famous one day, Emily," he had told her under the old oak tree where they used to sit for hours. "And what about you?" she had asked, tilting her head. "I'll be rich enough to buy you a castle to write in." They had laughed, young, naive, in love but too afraid to admit it. And then life had pulled them apart. Daniel had left for New York to build his empire. Emily had stayed behind. They lost touch, and now he was back. But for what? Did she ever think about him the way he thought about her? Did she ever wonder what could have been? A heart-stopping sight stepping out of his car, Daniel adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored suit as he walked toward the school entrance. His presence turned heads, teachers whispering, students sneaking glances at the billionaire standing in their hallway. And then he saw her. At first he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but no, it was her. Emily Carter stood at the far end of the hallway, a mop in hand, her delicate fingers wrapped around the worn wooden handle. His breath caught in his throat. She was older now, of course, more mature, more beautiful in a way that time and struggle had only refined. But there was something different, a tiredness in her posture, a quiet sadness in her eyes as she wiped the floors with the same grace she once carried in her dreams. Daniel felt the world tilt beneath him. This couldn't be right. Emily was supposed to be a writer, a storyteller, a woman who conquered the world with her words. Not this. An unspoken pain for a moment. He couldn't move. He just stood there, watching her. His chest tightened with emotions too complicated to name. How had life been so cruel to her? A billion-dollar empire, dozens of properties, private jets, and yet, this moment shattered him in a way no business failure ever could. He wanted to go to her, to say something, but before he could, Emily looked up. Their eyes met. The world stopped. For a brief second, recognition flickered in her gaze, a ghost from the past, a story unfinished. And then, just as quickly, she looked away, as if he was no one. She turned, gripping the mop tighter, and walked away without a word. Daniel's heart clenched. Something was terribly wrong. Emily wasn't just avoiding him, she was hiding something. And for the first time in years, Daniel Hayes realized he had just found something worth fighting for. The air inside the high school felt suffocating. Daniel Hayes, a billionaire whose name graced Forbes covers, had faced ruthless investors, cutthroat negotiations, and high-stakes deals, but nothing had prepared him for the storm of emotions that raged inside him now. His heart was still racing from the moment he locked eyes with Emily Carter. She saw me, I know she did. Yet she had turned away, walked past him like a stranger. Why? The weight of 1,000 unspoken words. Daniel's grip tightened around the glass of whiskey he held at the gala later that evening. The high school fundraiser event was in full swing, elegant decor, soft music, and distinguished guests who had all come to donate and celebrate education. But he barely heard a word anyone said. His mind was stuck on the woman he had once loved in silence. She was here, so close yet, it felt like she was a million miles away. How did this happen to you, Emily? The question clawed at him. She had been the most ambitious, brilliant and passionate girl he had ever known. She was supposed to be an author, living her dreams, not scrubbing floors in a place that once held her aspirations. Did life break you or did you let it? His jaw tightened, he had to talk to her. A moment of fate. He scanned the room, his eyes searching for her like a desperate man chasing a mirage. And then he saw her. She stood near the back, her hands neatly clasped in front of her, wearing a simple faded dress, so different from the other women in their glittering gowns. And yet, to him, she was the most beautiful person in the room. His breath caught. She hadn't changed, not really. The softness in her face, the quiet strength in her posture, the grace with which she held herself despite everything. It was still Emily. He moved before he could stop himself. Every step toward her felt heavier, like he was walking through memories and regrets. Emily turned just as he reached her, and for a split second he saw it, the flicker of recognition, the moment of hesitation. But then her expression hardened. A polite, distant mask fell over her face. Carter, she said flatly, as if his name meant nothing to her. His chest tightened. That's all I am to you now, he asked, forcing a smile to hide the ache in his voice. She tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like a defense mechanism. You're an important guest at this event, I'm just a janitor. We don't exactly belong in the same conversation, do we? Her words hit him harder than any business loss ever had. Emily, he began, but she shook her head. It's nice to see you again, she cut in, lying through her teeth. I should get back to work. She turned away. Something inside Daniel snapped. No, his voice was low, firm, filled with an emotion he couldn't control. Emily froze, her fingers tightening around the tray she was carrying. You don't get to pretend like we never knew each other, he said, stepping closer. Too close, close enough to see the way her breath hitched. That was a long time ago, Daniel, she whispered. His name. She still said his name the way she used to. That doesn't change what we were, he murmured, his voice barely above a breath. Her eyes darted up to meet his, and for a brief moment, he saw the girl he used to know. The one who had laughed under the oak tree with him, who had shared her dreams so fearlessly. And then, just as quickly, she shut it away. People change, not us. Silence for a second. Daniel thought, hoped she might let her guard down. But instead she straightened her shoulders, her expression unreadable. Enjoy the gala, Mr. Carter, she said, and then she walked away. And just like that, he lost her again. But this time he wasn't going to let her go. Daniel had always been a man of control. In boardrooms, his voice dictated the fate of billion-dollar deals. In life he moved with calculated precision, making decisions that shaped empires. But standing in the high school hallway, watching Emily Walker walk away from him once again, he felt utterly powerless. She wasn't just avoiding him, she was running. And Daniel Carter had never been the kind of man to let something slip away, especially not the only woman he had ever loved. A question that won't let him rest. The gala ended hours ago, but Daniel couldn't leave town just yet. Not like this. He sat in his luxury suite at the city's finest hotel, staring at the untouched glass of whiskey on the table. His thoughts were a storm, and at the center of it was her, Emily. The girl who once believed the world had magic in it. The girl who dreamed of writing stories that would change lives. The girl he had left behind, and now she was here, cleaning floors, avoiding him, pretending like they had never meant anything to each other. But why? What had life done to her? Or worse, what had he done to her? His fists clenched, he needed answers, and there was only one way to get them. The confrontation. The next morning, Daniel found her exactly where he knew she would be. The school was nearly empty, the early sunlight streaming through the glass windows, casting long shadows in the hallway. She was alone, mopping the floor, her movements slow, almost tired. Daniel leaned against the wall, watching her. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her lips slightly parted as she worked. She was still so beautiful, even in a worn-out uniform, with strands of hair falling from the messy bun atop her head. She was breathtaking. And for a moment he just stood there, taking in the quiet grace she carried, despite everything. Then he spoke. "Tell me why." Emily froze. She gripped the mop tighter, her shoulders stiffening, but she didn't turn around. "Tell me why you're acting like we never happened." His voice was low, controlled, but lined with something raw. Slowly she turned, her eyes met his, and for the first time since he had returned, he saw it. Not just sadness, not just exhaustion, but pain, deep, unspoken, buried beneath years of silence. "I don't owe you anything, Daniel," she said softly. The words stung. "You think I don't deserve an explanation?" He stepped closer, too close. Close enough that he could see the slight tremble of her fingers. "You left," she whispered. The accusation was quiet, but it felt like a knife straight to his soul. "I had to, Emily. You knew that. I knew you would leave, Daniel. I just never thought you wouldn't come back." Silence. For the first time in years, Daniel Carter was speechless. A heart that never stopped loving. Emily let out a shaky breath, stepping back. "It doesn't matter anymore," she continued, forcing a small bitter smile. "You're here now. The great Daniel Carter, billionaire philanthropist, everyone's hero. What do you want from me?" The word was out before he could stop it. Emily's breath hitched, her eyes widened slightly, her lips parting, but then she shook her head, laughing softly, a heartbreaking kind of laugh. "No, Daniel," she murmured. "You wanted the world, and you got it. I'm just a forgotten page in your story." She turned to leave, but this time he wasn't letting her go. Without thinking, he reached for her wrist, gentle, but firm. Emily sucked in a breath, her body freezing at the touch. It was the first time in years they had been this close. Skin against skin, heat against heat, heat against heat. Daniel felt her pulse racing beneath his fingers. She felt it too. "I never forgot you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Her eyes shimmered with something dangerously close to hope. "Then why did you never come back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He swallowed hard. The answer was complicated, but one thing was clear. He was here now, and he wasn't leaving without her. Emily's wrist was still in Daniel's grasp. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. For a moment time stood still. Emily could feel the warmth of his skin against hers, the roughness of his touch, a reminder that he was real, standing right in front of her, but she couldn't afford to fall for this. Not again. She swallowed hard and pulled her hand away. "It doesn't matter now," she whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened, his heart clenched at her words. "It matters to me." Emily looked up, her breath catching when she saw the intensity in his gaze. His eyes deep, piercing, full of emotions she had long tried to forget. "Why, Daniel?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. "Why now? Why after all these years?" He exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady the storm inside him. "Because I should have come back for you." Emily's chest tightened. God, how many years had she waited to hear those words? How many nights had she dreamed of this exact moment? But dreams were just that, dream. And real life had taught her something painful. Sometimes love, it seemed to know. A night that changed everything. Daniel could see the fight in her eyes, the struggle between holding on and letting go. But he needed to know. He needed the truth. Tell me what happened to you, Emily, he urged. You were going to be a writer. You had dreams. What happened? She flinched, looking away. Daniel's heart sank. There was something she wasn't telling him. Emily. His voice softened, his fingers itching to touch her again, to hold her, comfort her, take away whatever pain she was hiding. But Emily wrapped her arms around herself, as if shielding her heart. I don't owe you my story, she murmured. Maybe not, he admitted. But I want to hear it. Anyway, she let out a breathless laugh, bitter, hollow. And why is that, Daniel? Guilt, pity, or is it just another challenge for you? The billionaire who thinks he can fix everything with his money. His chest ached. That's not fair. No, she said, her voice suddenly sharp. What's not fair is how you left me behind like I never mattered. The words hit him like a slap. Emily, do you know what that night did to me? Her voice trembled now. Do you even remember? And suddenly he was back there. Flashback, the night of goodbye. The night air had been cold, but Emily had barely noticed. She stood by the lake, arms wrapped around herself, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. Daniel was leaving, going to chase his dreams, and she was happy for him. Wasn't she? Say something, Daniel had pleaded, his hands gripping her shoulders. Don't just stand there, Em. But what was she supposed to say? That she was scared, that she was afraid he'd forget about her, that she was falling in love with him, and didn't know how to stop. Go, Daniel, she had whispered instead. You were never meant to stay in this town. She had expected him to fight back, to tell her she was wrong, that he would come back for her. But he hadn't. He had just looked at her, and then he had walked away. Back to the present. Daniel remembered everything now. He had left because he thought she wanted him to. But now, looking at her, he realized the truth. You thought I abandoned you, he whispered, realization sinking in. Emily's lips trembled, but she held herself together. You did, she breathed. And God, he wanted to take back every single moment he had been away from her. I wrote to you, he admitted, for months, but you never replied. Emily flinched, her eyes darted away, something like guilt flashing across her face. Daniel frowned. You never got my letters, did you? She bit her lip tightly. Emily, his voice softened, laced with suspicion. She exhaled shakily. No, Daniel's blood turned cold. Who stopped them? Silence. Then she let out a broken whisper. My father. His world tilted. Your father. He hated you, Daniel. Her voice cracked. He said you'd never come back, that I was just a distraction for you. He took your letters. He told me you forgot her. And she looked up at him now, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I believed him. Daniel felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. So all these years, she had thought he never cared. She had believed she was nothing more than a passing memory to him. And all this time, he had been trying to reach her. Emily, he breathed, stepping closer. But she stepped back. It doesn't matter now, Daniel, she whispered. His hands clenched at his sides. It does to me. She shook her head. It's too late. No. His voice was firm, his heart pounding. Not this time. I'm not letting you go again. Her lips parted, something in her eyes flickering. Hope, fear, longing. And Daniel made a silent vow. Whatever had happened, whatever pain lay between them, he was going to fix it. Because losing Emily once had nearly destroyed him, and he would never survive losing her again. Emily's confession lingered in the air, like an unfinished melody. Daniel could hardly breathe. He had spent years aching for her, searching for answers, believing she had moved on. But all this time, the truth had been buried under lies, stolen letters, and a fox's cruel manipulation. I believed him. Those words echoed in his mind, slicing through him like a blade. How different would their lives have been if she had known the truth? His fists clenched at his sides. As he stepped closer, his voice a low, deep whisper. Emily, look at me. She hesitated. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around herself, as if trying to keep her heart from shattering all over again. I said, look at me. Daniel repeated, His voice softened this time. Slowly she lifted her gaze, and what he saw broke him. Tears, pain, longing, the same emotions he had been carrying in his own heart for years. God, she was still so beautiful, not just in the way her deep brown eyes held a storm of emotions, or the way her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but in the way she still made him feel like a boy standing on the edge of something terrifyingly real. A love that never died. I would have never left you, Emily, Daniel said, his voice raw with emotion. If I had known, I would have what? Emily cut in, her voice shaking. He exhaled sharply. I would have fought for you. I would have taken you with me. She let out a small bitter laugh, not because she didn't believe him, but because believing him now would hurt even more. It doesn't matter anymore, Daniel. That was years ago. We're different people now. You can say that all you want, he murmured, his blue eyes darkening with an intensity that made her breath hitch. But you can't tell me you don't still feel this. His hand brushed against hers, just the slightest touch, but it sent a shiver down her spine. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. Don't do this, she whispered. Do what? Make me feel things I have no right to feel anymore. Daniel's jaw clenched. He wasn't letting her go. Not this time. Who says you don't have the right? She took a shaky breath. Because you have a life now, Daniel. A life that doesn't include a janitor who barely makes ends meet. The way she said it, so full of self-doubt, so full of pain, sent anger burning through his veins. Don't do that, he growled. Do what? She whispered. Talk about yourself like that. Like you're nothing. Like you don't matter. His voice was rough, edged with something desperate. You were always meant for more, Emily. You deserved more. Emily let out a broken breath, turning away. Maybe, she admitted, but life doesn't always give us what we deserve. She walked toward the janitor's closet, ready to end the conversation, but Daniel wasn't done. He wasn't letting her slip away like this. Not again. The walls begin to crumble. Emily, he called out, his voice softer now. She hesitated at the doorway. Come with me. Her fingers tightened around the doorknob. What? Come with me, tonight, he said, taking slow, deliberate steps toward her. Daniel, one night, no expectations, no past, just us. She turned around, shaking her head. And then what? What happens when the night is over? Then I'll ask for another. Her breath hitched, and another. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the empty promise. But there was none, only Daniel, only the boy she had once loved, and the man who had never truly let her go. She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. This was dangerous. This was reckless. But for the first time in years, it felt like something she wanted to risk. So when she whispered, okay, she wasn't just agreeing to a night. She was agreeing to letting Daniel peers back into her heart, even if it meant he could break it all over again. The city lights flickered like scattered diamonds as Daniel drove through the quiet streets, the hum of the engine filling the silence between them. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap, her heart racing. She had agreed to this. One night, no expectations, no past. But could she really pretend that her heart wasn't still aching for him? An evening of longing, Daniel pulled up in front of a luxurious penthouse, a place so grand it looked straight out of a dream. Emily hesitated as she stepped out of the car, her breath catching at the sight of the massive glass windows overlooking the city skyline. "I don't belong here, Daniel," she whispered. He turned to her, his blue eyes dark with emotion. "You belong wherever I am." Her chest tightened. God, why did he have to say things like that? She followed him inside, the warmth of the penthouse wrapping around her like an embrace. Soft music played in the background, a slow, sensual melody that filled the space between them. Emily walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing her palm against the cool glass. "It's beautiful," she murmured, staring out at the city. "So are you." She turned to find Daniel standing close, too close. Her pulse quickened. The way he looked at her, like she was something precious, something he never wanted to lose, made her knees weak. Why are we here, Daniel? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because I needed to be with you tonight, he admitted. Not as a billionaire, not as a man trying to fix the past, just as a man who never stopped loving you. Her breath hitched. How was she supposed to protect herself from a man who knew exactly how to break down her walls? Dancing with shadows, Daniel extended a hand toward her. Dance with me, she hesitated. But when he took her hand, a spark ignited between them. He pulled her close, his hands settling on her waist as she rested hers lightly on his shoulders. They swayed to the rhythm, their bodies fitting together like they were always meant to. Emily closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, rich, warm, familiar. This feels dangerous, she whispered. Because it is, he murmured against her hair. She pulled back slightly, looking up at him. His gaze dropped to her lips. The air between them turned electric. Daniel, she started, but her voice trailed off when he lifted a hand, brushing his fingers across her cheek. Tell me you don't want this, he whispered. Tell me, and I'll stop. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was sure he could hear it. But she didn't say a word. She couldn't. Because she wanted this. She wanted him. With a soft sigh, she melted against him, her arms tightening around his neck, as his lips finally met hers. The kiss was slow, deep, filled with years of longing and unsaid words. Daniel held her like she was something fragile yet precious, something he would never take for granted again. The world outside disappeared. It was just them, two souls who had been torn apart, finally finding their way back to each other. A moment of vulnerability. As the kiss ended, Emily rested her forehead against his chest, trying to catch her breath. I'm scared, Daniel, she admitted. He cupped her face, tilting it up so she had no choice but to look at him. Of what? Of what happens after tonight? His expression softened. Then let me show you that tonight isn't the end. It's just the beginning. Her heart clenched. Could she believe that? Could she risk loving him again? As she stared into his eyes, full of love, regret, and silent promises, she realized she had already made her decision. Maybe she had made it the moment she saw him again. Maybe she had never truly stopped being his. And maybe, just maybe, he had never stopped being hers. Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wrapped in the warmth of Daniel's arms. His steady breath brushed against her hair, his heart beat a soft rhythm against her back. It felt safe. It felt right. But that was the most terrifying part of all. What if this was just a moment? What if, come morning, reality crashed in and reminded her exactly where she belonged, on the outside, looking in? She swallowed hard, blinking back the tears threatening to spill. She had already lost Daniel once. Could she survive losing him again? The morning after, the first rays of sunlight peeked through the curtains, casting a golden glow over the room. Emily stirred, realizing Daniel was already awake, watching her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Morning, he murmured, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. She forced a small smile. Morning. For a moment neither of them moved. The weight of unspoken words hung between them. Daniel's hand found hers, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles on her palm. Tell me what you're thinking, he said softly. Emily hesitated. How could she put into words the storm inside her? How could she tell him that being with him again felt like breathing after years of suffocation, but it also felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the fall? I don't know how to do this, Daniel, she admitted, finally. Do what? Be with you, be us again. His grip on her hand tightened. Then let me remind you. Before she could respond, he pulled her into his arms, pressing a slow, lingering kiss to her forehead. I know you're scared, Emily, but I meant what I said last night. This isn't just a moment to me. It's not something I can walk away from. Her throat tightened. But what if I'm not enough for your world? She whispered. Daniel's eyes darkened, a flash of frustration and hurt crossing his features. Emily, look at me. She hesitated, but he tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. You were always enough. You were always everything. Her breath caught. It was never about you not being enough. It was about the world taking you away from me before I could fight for you. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Daniel caught it with his thumb, his touch gentle, reverent. But I'm here now, and I will fight for you, Emily, every single day, if that's what it takes. Her heart ached, twisted, longed. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself fall. But the fear was still there, lingering like a shadow, and Daniel saw it. So he did the only thing he could. He pulled her close and kissed her like he was sealing a promise with his soul. A test of faith later that morning, as Emily got dressed, reality began creeping back in. What happened next? Did she return to work like nothing had changed? Did she walk out of his penthouse, knowing she had given a piece of herself to him again? She wasn't sure how to navigate this, but before she could drown in her thoughts, Daniel walked up behind her, sliding his arms around her waist. Stay, her breath hitched. Daniel, stay with me today. Let me show you what life with me could be like. It was tempting, so tempting, but she shook her head. I have to work. His jaw clenched. I could make a call. No. She turned in his arms, resting a hand against his chest. I need to do this. I need to hold on to the part of my life that's mine. He studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right, but I'm picking you up after your shift. She arched a brow. Are you always this persistent? His lips curled into a smirk. When it comes to you, always. A harsh reminder. Emily stepped back into the cold, sterile hallways of the building where she worked. The scent of cleaning supplies, the distant hum of conversations. It was a world apart from the luxury of Daniel's life. She had spent the night wrapped in warmth, in love, in a dream that felt too fragile to be real. But here, reality slammed into her. Emily, she turned to find Clara, her supervisor, marching toward her, arms crossed. You're late, again. Emily swallowed. I know, if you keep slipping up, you're going to lose this job. The words stung. Maybe Clara didn't mean to sound cruel, but it was a reminder Emily couldn't ignore. Her life wasn't like Daniel's. She didn't have the luxury of just falling in love and hoping everything would work out. She had bills, a small apartment, a job she needed to survive, and yet, even as she pushed the mop across the floor, her mind kept drifting back to him. To the way he looked at her, like she was the most precious thing in the world. To the way he kissed her, like he was trying to make up for all the years they had lost. To the way he made her feel like she was still that girl he had loved, all those years ago. A grand gesture. At the end of her shift, Emily stepped outside, exhausted. But the moment she saw the black luxury car waiting at the curb, her breath caught. Daniel, leaning against the sleek car, dressed in a crisp suit, he looked completely out of place in her world, and yet, he was there, for her. She hesitated, her heart pounding. Could she really let herself have this? Could she let herself believe in him? Before she could turn away, Daniel walked up to her, his gaze never leaving hers. You came, she whispered. I told you I would. He reached for her hand, lifting it to his lips. Emily, it doesn't matter where you come from, what you do, or what you think separates us. His voice was deep, serious, filled with something unshakable. I will meet you wherever you are. I will fight for you, until you believe that you belong with me. Her throat tightened. No one had ever fought for her before. No one but Daniel. Maybe it was time to let herself fall. A leap of faith. Emily stood frozen outside the Grand Hotel entrance, her small calloused hand still resting in Daniel's. His words echoed in her mind, like a melody she had been afraid to believe in. I will meet you wherever you are. I will fight for you, until you believe that you belong with me. She wanted to trust him. She wanted to let herself believe in the love shining in his eyes. But deep down, a voice whispered, what if this isn't real? What if this is just a passing infatuation for him? A rich man's moment of nostalgia. And when the excitement fades, when the reality of who you are crashes in, will he still stay? Her heart ached under the weight of uncertainty, and Daniel saw it. With a sigh he stepped closer, tilting her chin up, so she had no choice but to meet his gaze. Emily, stop thinking. His voice was gentle but firm. Just feel. And before she could argue, before she could drown in her doubts, he kissed her, not just a kiss, a promise. His lips moved over hers, with a slow, aching tenderness, as if pouring years of longing, regret and love into this single moment. Emily melted. The fight inside her, the fear, the walls, they all crumbled. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was alive. A night of reckoning. Daniel took her to his penthouse, overlooking the city skyline. It was breathtaking. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, chandeliers that glittered like stars. Emily felt out of place, too small for a world so grand. Daniel must have sensed it, because he took her hands in his, pulling her closer. "This isn't just my world anymore, Emily. It's ours." Her breath hitched. "Daniel, I don't know how to be a part of this life." He smiled, brushing a soft kiss against her forehead. "Then let me show you." The night passed in whispered confessions, in laughter that felt like home, in stolen kisses that left her breathless. For the first time, Emily didn't hold back. She let herself love him. A cruel interruption. The next morning, Emily woke up wrapped in Daniel's warmth. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe this was forever, until the shrill ring of Daniel's phone shattered the peace. He groaned, reaching for it. Emily turned away, giving him privacy, until she heard the voice on the other end. "Daniel, we need to talk. It's about your engagement." Her blood turned to ice. A heartbreaking truth. Emily shot up, staring at Daniel in horror. "Engagement?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Daniel's face darkened as he ended the call. "It's not what you think." Her stomach twisted. "Then explain." He exhaled sharply. "Months ago, my parents tried to arrange a marriage for me to a business partner's daughter. It was never real to me, Emily. I never even met her properly. But my family, your family," she repeated, voice shaking. "They still want you to marry her." His silence was answer enough. Emily felt the weight of reality crash down on her. Of course, she was just a janitor, and he was still a billionaire. Love was never that simple. Tears burned in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I can't do this, Daniel." Her voice cracked. "I can't be the woman who comes second. Not again." He grabbed her hands. "You're not second, Emily. You're the only one. I'll fix this, I swear to you." She pulled away, her heart shattering. "I have to go." The breaking point. Emily walked out. Daniel chased after her, calling her name, but she kept walking. Because love wasn't just words, it was choices, it was actions. And if Daniel truly loved her, he had to fight for her. Not just with kisses and sweet promises, but with everything. The grand gesture. 3 days passed. Emily tried to move on, tried to pretend like her heart wasn't in pieces. But then a headline changed everything. "Billionaire Daniel Hayes publicly rejects arranged engagement. My heart belongs to someone else." Her breath caught as she read his statement. "There is only one woman I will ever love, and I will fight for her, no matter what it takes." Tears blurred her vision. Before she could think, there was a knock on her apartment door. She opened it, and there he was. Daniel, out of breath, eyes filled with raw, desperate love. "Say the word, Emily. Tell me you still want me, and I will spend every day proving that I belong to you, that we belong together." A single tear slipped down her cheek. "I never stopped wanting you, Daniel." And with that she fell into his arms, where she had always belonged. 1 year later, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across the vast vineyard estate in Napa Valley. The scent of roses and fresh lavender filled the air, as soft music played in the background. Emily stood before a grand mirror, her fingers trembling as they traced the delicate lace of her wedding gown. She could hardly believe it. She wasn't dreaming. She was about to marry the man who had loved her beyond her fears, beyond her doubts, beyond everything that tried to pull them apart. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned only to see Mrs. Hayes, Daniel's mother. Emily's breath caught. Despite everything, she still felt nervous around her. "May I come in?" Mrs. Hayes asked softly. Emily nodded. The older woman stepped closer, holding something in her hands, a diamond-encrusted hairpin. "This belonged to my mother," she murmured. I wore it on my wedding day. And today I'd like you to wear it. Emily's eyes widened. You mean? Mrs. Hayes smiled, her eyes warm with genuine acceptance. You proved me wrong, my dear. I once thought you didn't belong in this world. But the truth is, this world is better with you in it. A tear slipped down Emily's cheek. Thank you, she whispered, and as Mrs. Hayes pinned the jewel into her hair, Emily finally believed it. She belonged here, with Daniel, forever. The wedding kept a love that conquered all. The wedding aisle felt endless, but Emily had never walked a path more certain. Her heart pounded as she saw Daniel standing at the altar, dressed in a classic black tuxedo, looking like every romantic dream she had ever dared to have. But the most beautiful thing wasn't his suit. It was the way he looked at her, as if she was the only woman in the world. The moment she reached him, he took her hands, squeezing them gently. You're breathtaking, he murmured. Her lips trembled. So are you. The priest's voice faded into the background as they exchanged vows, whispering their love with words that barely held the depth of their hearts. I, Daniel Hayes, take you, Emily Carter, to be my wife, to love you, cherish you, and stand beside you, no matter where life takes us. Emily's eyes glistened. And I, Emily Carter, take you, Daniel Hayes, to be my husband, to trust you, love you, and remind you every day that I am home, wherever you are. When the priest declared them husband and wife, Daniel didn't wait. He pulled her in and kissed her with all the love, all the promises, all the devotion that had brought them to this moment. The world erupted in applause, but to them, it was just their hearts, beating as one. A future written in the stars. Months later, on a quiet summer evening, Emily and Daniel stood on the balcony of their new home, a cozy, beautiful house, overlooking the ocean. Emily rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't recognized me that day? She asked softly. Daniel chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. Impossible. I would have found you. In this lifetime, in any lifetime. He turned her chin up, his eyes filled with endless love. I would always find you, Emily. A soft breeze passed between them, and in that moment, she knew their love wasn't just fate, it was a choice they had made, against all odds, a choice they would make, every single day, for the rest of their lives. A night under the stars. The soft glow of candlelight flickered over the elegantly set dinner table on the private terrace of their home. Emily stood near the edge of the balcony, her gaze lost in the endless waves of the ocean below. 1 year, she whispered to herself. 1 year of love. 1 year of love. Of whispered secrets in the dark, of kisses that never lost their fire. 1 year of belonging. And yet, even after all this time, her heart still raced whenever Daniel walked into the room. She felt his presence before she saw him. Warm hands wrapped around her waist from behind, pulling her into the safety of his embrace. Happy anniversary, my love, Daniel whispered against her ear, his breath sending shivers down her spine. Emily turned in his arms, her smile radiant under the moonlight. Happy anniversary, Mr. Hayes. He chuckled, his deep, rich laughter still as intoxicating as the first time she had heard it. Do you know what today means? He asked, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. That you've somehow survived a whole year with me, she teased. Daniel smirked. That, and the fact that I get to love you for another lifetime, and then another after that. Her heart fluttered. Even after a year, he still had the power to make her feel like the most precious thing in the world. A surprise that took her breath away. As they sat down for dinner, Emily noticed something odd. Instead of an elaborate, extravagant meal fit for a billionaire's anniversary, Daniel had set up something simple. A plate of mac and cheese. Her eyes widened. Wait, is this? Daniel grinned. The same mac and cheese from the janitor's break room. Emily burst out laughing, covering her mouth. I can't believe you remember. How could I forget? He said, leaning closer. That was the first time I saw you smile again. And that was the moment I knew I never wanted to spend another day without you. Tears pricked at Emily's eyes. This man,
This beautiful, wonderful man, who had everything in the world, and yet he still cherished the smallest, simplest moments with her. Daniel, I love you so much, she whispered, voice trembling. He reached across the table, lacing their fingers together. Then let's make a promise. Emily tilted her head. What kind of promise? His eyes softened. No matter how rich we get, no matter where life takes us, every year, on this day, we come back to the basics, to the simple things that made us fall in love in the first place. Emily smiled through her tears. Mac and cheese and stargazing. And a dance, Daniel added, standing up and offering his hand. A dance of forever. The soft hum of a love song played in the background as Daniel pulled Emily into his arms. They swayed under the open sky, the stars their only witnesses. Emily rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. You know, I spent years thinking I wasn't enough for you, she admitted softly. Daniel tightened his hold on her. Emily, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. You were always enough. You were more than enough. And I will spend every day reminding you of that. She lifted her head, gazing into the eyes of the man who had given her everything. Then let's keep dancing, Daniel, he smiled. For how long? Emily twirled once before falling back into his embrace. For the rest of our lives. And as Daniel leaned in, capturing her lips in a soft, lingering kiss, the stars above shone just a little brighter, because this was love, timeless, unbreakable, eternal.